Chapter 13: Christianity and Contemporary American Culture. We have noted previously that Christianity is often defined by the cultural context in which it appears, and that, with few exceptions, it is unable to influence that culture to accept its doctrines. Intertwined with cultural and religious change is certainly the historical era in which the contact is made between a religion and a culture. And Christianity may have done yeoman service in calming the Germanic tribes and enticing them away from barbarism. But the ferocity of which Nazi ideology wreaked its havoc on Europe should cause us to wonder how much savagery Christianity actually abolished from the psychological makeup of European man. American Christianity, in particular, appears to be a willing captive of American culture. The trend of recent years has only accentuated the traditional role of Christianity in American society as one of the buttressing official folklore and patriotism. It is extremely difficult to discern whether American Christianity follows the culture, expressing its variations religiously, or whether it really does open up new avenues of social reality for consideration. At best, we can worry that religion is in deep trouble when it finds it's necessary to make itself attractive to a society in the hopes that the society will consider it worthy of its attention. Perhaps the most publicized movement of recent years among Christians has been the Jesus movement. Theories abound as to the exact origin of this movement, but at least one reputable theory is that it came as a desperate effort by young people to get off drugs. Whether these young people were tired of drugs or whether drugs were in such short supply that they were forced to find a substitute may be the thesis of a future sociologist. At any rate, Jesus became a drug substitute for a significant number of people, recounting how Jesus was a perpetual high. Numerous young people adopted the complete fanaticism that had characterized the earlier flower children, civil rights, and anti-war movements. There does not seem to have been a theological basis of any depth within the Jesus movement. Evangelists hailed it as the greatest development in religion in recent years, foreseeing a new generation of the clean-shaven, white buck-wearing Christians with whom they became familiar in the 1950s. Strangely, the chief characteristic of the Jesus movement was its absolutism, which led to violent intolerance of other ideas. And while many of its followers proclaimed their faith in Jesus, few knew any of the details of the life of Jesus, the Jewish carpenter. A recent development of the Jesus movement has been the organization of parents to kidnap the youngsters involved in the movement and take them to debriefing stations, where they are gradually returned to normal secular values and concerns. The possibility of psychic injury to participants of the movement has probably not occurred to the parents of these young people. But an additional, more serious question plagues us. How can these parents keep up the pretense of being Christians, celebrating Christmas, and doing all those other fun things that adult Christians do, and then react with horror when their children join Christian communities to follow the gospel full time? Christianity is apparently something that can be taken seriously, but not too seriously. And while the Jesus experience was described by ex-addicts as a trip, one man really elaborated on this theme. The Reverend Wesley Sillinger, an Episcopalian chaplain at Texas A&M, viewed Christianity as a trip in his new frontier theology. The church, according to Seeliger, is a battered covered wagon, and God is a determined and driving trail boss. Jesus is the scout who rides out in front of the wagon train. Seeliger's theology was published initially in a 15-cent cartoon format and sold more than 12,000 copies at Texas A&M, a noted center of philosophical and theological study. Against the frontier theology, Seeliger sees the temptation of Christianity to form a settler's theology, and this tension between rolling wagons headed westward and the sedate and comfortable life in the frontier town is apparently what has been causing a lot of our problems. In the settler's theology, God is seen as the mayor of the old frontier town. The citizens never see him, but they are certain he exists because they have law and order. And the townspeople are scared to death of the mayor, but he keeps the old payroll coming in. And after all, that's what made America great. Meanwhile, out on the prairie, the old wagon train keeps rolling along. We are presently in the age of the Spirit, and sure enough, there he is, the Holy Spirit, as the old buffalo hunter, bringing in fresh meat to the people on the wagon train every morning. The clergy appears as the cast of characters as Wishbone and Jesus used to complement Mr. Favor and Rowdy Yates of the old television Rawhide series. They serve up that old buffalo meat whenever the people have a hankering for food. One need not comment on how this particular theology was received on the Indian reservations. A theological development of recent vintage approaching the Western violence-prone trend of frontier theology is the emphasis on judo, karate, and other Oriental fighting skills. The Reverend Mr. Mike Crane of Brownsville, Kentucky, runs a judo and karate for Christ camp. Karate is, according to Crane, useful in fighting off the devil. We are teaching young people how to defend themselves against man, the good pastor has said. Then we talk to them about how to defend themselves against Satan. Crane travels around the nation giving demonstrations and preaching sermons. To emphasize his point, he often shatters a 300-pound block of ice. Crane is not unique, however, because karate is the coming thing in the Christian ideology. Dean Blakeney, a fellow Christian who studied karate at North Georgia College and Tennessee Temple Theological Seminary, is also using karate to bring home the message of God's reconciliation with a sinful world. Blakeney, apparently, is further advanced in the Christian life, for, besides karate, he uses swords and curved Turkish Gurkha knives in his ministry. Recently, he placed a potato on the stomach of one of the faithful and split it with a sword without harming the fellow Christian who he noted had already been saved. Then he cleaved a watermelon into two pieces with his Gurkha knife, and to the amazement of his audience. His final knife act on behalf of the Lord was serving a banana, which was placed near the neck of one of his disciples. Blakeney performed all these Christian feats in the cafeteria of the New Testament Baptist Church in Miami in the fall of 1972. His performance was clearly superior to the feats recorded in the New Testament when Peter attempted the same feat and bungled, severing the ear of the servant of the high priest of the temple in the Garden of Gethsemane. Blakeney lined up 4 concrete blocks and 1/2 inches thick and drove his head through them, shattering them. He explained, "These concrete blocks represent your life, and one day the devil is going to try to break your life just like I did these blocks." Blakeney's final sermonette left something to the imagination. He had 4 men place a 150-pound slab of ice on the stage. "I'd like to do the devil what I'm about to do to this ice." He chanted as he gave the ice a massive and highly religious karate chop. The block of ice remained firm as Blakeney lost his first encounter with the devil. Had he had a sudden lapse of faith? Was his faith half as strong as that of Crane, who splits 300-pound blocks of ice with little emotion and considerably less pain? Or was it simply denomination differences that allowed Crane to vanquish the devil, but tore victory from Blakeney's grasp? Christians, Crane, and Blakeney were not alone in their belief that Christianity is relevant to athletic ability. And Paul Anderson, an Olympic weightlifting champion, preached a sermon a couple of years back in which he credited his strength to his religious faith. And during this historic revelation, Anderson lifted 200 pounds with one arm. Not one of his devout audience apparently felt religious enough to duplicate the feat. And immediately, raising the question of the relative effectiveness of the Christian faith as oppressed to simple athletic training. Other signs of the efficacy of the Christian faith were noted by the Reverend Noel Street, a British spiritual healer who visited the United States in 1970. He noted to have a good spiritual life with mental and physical health, one must live a Christian life. Later, he elaborated on this prescription, adding that one should also be a strict vegetarian, do yoga, or any good regular exercise, and avoid smoking and alcohol. Like Christian karate, yoga is a difficult word to find in either the Greek or Latin versions of the Bible. Some Christian churches have refused to venture into the new realms of religious realism, with new theologies remaining fairly close to familiar American traditions. The Cathedral of Tomorrow, for example, has followed the New Testament teachings on the talents, wisely investing in earnings and business. It owns the Unity Electronic Company of New Jersey, the Nassau Plastic and Wire Company of Long Island, and land for a shopping center near its headquarters in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. Its best investment so far, however, is the Real Form Girdle Company of Brooklyn, New York. Knowing this, we can conclude that Christianity is in good shape in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. The Cathedral of Tomorrow did not stop with mere business investment, however, but launched into the sale of bonds for Mackinac College, gift annuity plans, life income agreements, and other security deposit agreements. The Ohio Department of Commerce, as well as 6 other states, has ordered a halt to these sales. Whether the cathedral was religious or not, it was plainly an enterprising group, and that, after all, is what made America great. The prize for merging religion and business must go, however, to the promoters of Holy Land, USA, a proposed $50 million biblical Disney-type theme park that was to be built on the Alabama Gulf Coast. The original promoter of Holy Land, USA, a man named Bill Kaywood, convinced a number of devout fundamentalists that the park would bring in an extra 3 million souls. Plans were made to erect a 157-foot statue of Jesus on a 57-foot base. The sculpture would be taller than the Statue of Liberty and would be visible for miles down the highway each way. A 4,000-seat amphitheater was to be built for the production of passion plays, but the features surrounding the central theme of the park were really what would have made it noteworthy. There was to be a Noah's Ark kitty petting zoo, a biblical wax museum, biblical storytellers, and a 100-foot replica of Jonah's whale. Roman chariots and drivers would be featured in daily rides for the devout believers. A Tower of Babel, Herod's palace, Wailing Wall, a Red Sea actually able to divide, a golden calf for the disbelievers, Solomon's temple, and a Roman catacomb were all planned. Finally, plans were made to develop an actual trip through heaven and hell for the more venturesome of the park's visitors. One can but speculate on the outpouring of devotion that this project would have inspired. Other churches have not invested in businesses or developed religious theme parks, but they have adopted modern business methods. The Congregational Church in Vergennes, Vermont, provided a credit card machine at the entrance of the church to allow parishioners to charge their gifts to the Lord. Vergennes is literally flooded with credit cards, the Reverend Richard Ogden stated, and since we are moving into a credit card age, there is no reason the church should remain aloof. Theologically, perhaps, MasterCard would be most suitable. The First Baptist Church in Hammond, Indiana, did not get its credit card machine in time, but it did get a fleet of buses to bring people right to the church door. It owns a fleet of 108 buses that weekly carry some 2,500 worshipers to the church. The fleet covers 76 different routes, and the church employs a full-time mechanic. The annual budget runs close to $80,000 for the fleet of buses, which includes 6,000 gallons of gas a month and about $5,000 worth of tires annually. The minister, who has obviously found peace with the Lord, remarked, "I think so much of building church growth through transportation that I'm spending my life working with buses rather than pastoring a church. And I have no regrets." At least, he must figure, when you save a bus, it stays saved. Christian churches in the Seattle, Washington area preferred to dance instead of ride. In 1970, they sponsored a course on soul, which was designed to teach African American culture to white parishioners. For $16, an 8-week course was offered that involved learning how to move to sound blasted forth on stereophonic equipment. The idea was to get whites used to moving their bodies in conjunction with the rhythm, and many of the participants liked the course, although one lady said that she did it just to torture her husband. Christianity, as we know from the New Testament, will pit father against son, mother against daughter, wife against husband. Other Christian churches have recently been involved in an exciting affirmation of the efficacy of the faith. Prior to the diocesan convention of the Episcopal Church in Colorado in 1970, the young priests of the diocese petitioned then Bishop Thayer for permission to hold a peace mass for those who wanted peace in Vietnam. And Bishop Thayer, a direct lineal descendant of the apostles according to official Episcopal doctrine, is reported to have told them that there are other ways of achieving peace besides praying for it. Sometimes, even when prayer works in its mysterious ways, it places a tremendous strain on the recipients of its benefits. Oral Roberts, longtime minister of the Pentecostal Holiness Church and nationally known faith healer, joined the Methodist Church. His success in the healing arts was unparalleled in modern times, since it enabled him to build Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which now has a fine basketball team with national ratings. Roberts is also a director of the Tulsa Chamber of Commerce and a director of one of the city's largest banks. And where the old chose martyrdom for Pete and Paul, he obviously had bigger things in mind for Roberts. And life has not been a bed of roses for Roberts in spite of his recent rise to prominence in Oklahoma. He told a Denver Post reporter of the great relief he had in joining the Methodist Church and leaving behind the great burden of faith healing. Faith healing was a great burden, Roberts commented to the reporter, because people expected miracles. And perhaps the most important Christian event of recent times was Explo 72, a giant rally held in June 1972 at the Cotton Bowl in Dallas, Texas, a city of brotherly love. It was conceived and carried out by Bill Bright of the Campus Crusade for Christ International, one of the many fundamentalist-oriented groups working on college campuses. More than 75,000 gospel preaching, sure enough, young Christians came to Dallas to conduct a historic rally on behalf of fundamentalist Christianity. Bright is something of a wonder himself, for he surpassed all previous expositors of the gospel except Jesus himself by reducing the Christian faith to four spiritual principles. God has a plan for everyone. Everyone sins. Jesus is God's method of correcting sin, and everyone must individually receive Jesus as Savior. To emphasize these four spiritual principles, Bright collected a group of Christian athletes, most notably Roger Staubach, former quarterback of the Dallas Cowboys. Outside of Jesus, Staubach was apparently the hit of the event by comparing life to a football game with salvation as the goal line and the Christian as being in good field position because of Christianity. It remained uncertain whether the Christians needed a touchdown or a field goal to win the game. Unlike the feeding of the 5,000, Explo 72 had a budget of $2.7 million and charged participants a $25 entrance fee, which was certainly an improvement over the New Testament way of doing things. For the entrance fee, enough potato chips were served to make a 1-ton potato chip, although apparently the Lord did not do so, and preferring to serve individual portions. The event was billed as a religious Woodstock, and it was advertised on 800 billboards, 100,000 bumper stickers, and 5,000 t-shirts. The festival featured all of the famous Christian personalities, including Don Wilkerson of the Cross and the Switchblade fame, the chaplain of Bourbon Street, the chaplain of Hollywood, and Dr. Billy Graham, who was honorary chairman of the great event. Graham expressed his confidence in the ability of the participants to distinguish false prophets from true ones. Folk singers Johnny Cash and Chris Christopherson were present to serenade the assembled multitude of faithful, and a band, the Armageddon Experience, helped to keep the assembled saints at a fever pitch. The climax to Explo 72 came when the 75,000 assembled young Christians broke forth in a frenzy of religious devotion and began chanting football cheers. "Give me a J, J, give me an E, E, give me an S, S, give me a U, U, give me a S, S. What do you got? Jesus!" The Sermon on the Mount pales in comparison. Oh, that's great. Anyone who could not distinguish between Christianity and contemporary American culture on the basis of X plus 72 was simply not receiving God's signals in the great football game of life. Had not Graham himself been present as honorary chairman, people might have had cause to wonder. But Graham had given his whole life to an exposition of the gospel, and although he had previously been unable to reduce it to the four spiritual principles, he was still highly regarded. And among Graham's achievements was his informal chaplaincy at the White House, which aroused the ire of Reinhold Niebuhr, who could very possibly not distinguish between true and false prophets, being a liberal and all. Niebuhr protested that Graham and the White House prophets were reducing religion to a civil obedience course that helped to cover problems, not solve them. Graham was very hurt at this charge, remarking that he was simply a personal friend of the president and not a political man. He later said that he would vote for Richard Nixon, basing his choice on the president's obvious morality and integrity. And perhaps Graham felt that a man who could remain oblivious to Watergate, the ITT affair, the Lockheed loan, the Hughes loan to his brother, and who would maintain a committee to re-elect him months after his re-election, must have the highest morals in the nation. Dr. Graham felt that his presence at the White House in no way endorsed the policies of the president. When asked to comment on the Vietnam situation, Graham replied that he spoke out only on the moral issues. And Graham's role in contemporary Christian thinking is buttressed by his lack of doubt. Having never attended a seminary, he did not have the opportunity to study Christian history or doctrine and had no chance to be led astray by the facts. He once related that he had no doubts whatsoever about Christianity since 1949, when he was converted on a golf course in Florida, calling into question, perhaps, Roger Staubach's theology, which viewed Christianity and life as football games. Some years ago, when Graham addressed a men's group in England, he compared life to a golf course in which one need only follow the rules to be greeted by the Lord after the game was over. Perhaps the greatest golfer of them all. While Graham is probably the most admired Christian in the modern world, it is difficult to distinguish his theological position as a religious leader and judge of morality from his participation in American cultural forms. He apparently swallows almost all of the traditional mythologies of American life without any critical analysis of whether they in fact relate to the Christian religion. In 1971, he was the Grand Marshal of the Rose Bowl parade, and he has consistently used sports metaphors as vehicles for his preaching. Graham supports athletics because the Bible says leisure and lying around are morally dangerous for us. But Graham contended, sports keep us busy. Athletes, you notice, don't take drugs. Ha! How any adult in this day and age can make that statement is perhaps the most incredible aspect of Graham's view of the world. In the political arena, it was virtually impossible to tell Graham from the rest of Nixon's aides. And when the president came to the University of Tennessee in 1970, one of the few campuses he dared to visit, to address Graham's revival meeting, a choir of 5,500 voices sang, "How great thou art." As Nixon was seated awaiting Graham's introduction, there remained some question as to which thou the choir was trumpeting. The avowed purpose of inviting Nixon to speak in Tennessee was to show the younger generation that the president is listening to them. This attitude meshes with his interpretation of religion as a buttress of civil and political structures. He was reported in Newsweek to have said, "I'm for change, but the Bible teaches us to obey authority." And Graham's crusade frequently is held in conjunction with other events of less theological stature. During his appearance at Madison Square Garden in 1969, a special hall was set up near the garden where rock and roll, interspersed with confessions of faith, continued all night after the famous evangelist sessions. Poor Graham was thus connected with at least some of those who did not take the command to obey seriously. But the participants apparently dug the session. It's amazing to hear those band members talk about Christ. One young visitor to the hall was heard to remark, the Reverend John Guist, leader of the sessions, called it getting back to the biblical principle of going where the people are. He probably could have added that the Christian church itself was founded on a rock. The confusion between Christianity and American culture is not simply a phenomenon of evangelical and right-wing Christianity. The liberal counterpart has made its contribution to making Christianity relevant to the modern world. The Lutheran Youth Congress, meeting in San Diego in 1972, originated the Jesus cheer, later repeated at the Cotton Bowl. In 1970, The United Church of Christ in Chicago held an unusual ordination ceremony that indicated it also had seen the light and was trying to make making religion relevant to American culture. The ordinated wore a multicolored vest with 17 symbols representing his concerns sewn on it. Included were symbols of joy and sorrow, a black fist, a Star of David, a peace symbol, a herald's trumpet, and wheat seeds. Two leotarded dancers conducted a moving prayer against a background of shifting images projected on the walls of the museum in which the service was held. Kent Schneider, the newly ordained minister, celebrated. He is director of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Celebration and will teach others to celebrate. He noted, "Celebration is an idea whose time has come. We will drink to that. Celebration may be the name of the game over on the left wing of the Christian spectrum, as football cheers seem to characterize the right wing." The Reverend Harvey Cox, author of Secular City and the liberal guru of the Boston area, decided in 1970 to combine all the elements of religion into one massive presentation. Choosing a congruence of holy days, Jewish Passover and Orthodox Easter, Cox gathered his disciples at the Boston Tea Party, a converted warehouse discotheque near Fenway Park. A projector flashed images on the walls to represent pictorially the agony of Vietnam, while participants wrote graffiti on the walls of the building. A rock band called the Apocrypha played "I Can't Get No Satisfaction," and at daybreak the crowd rushed into the streets, chanting, "Son, Son, Son." Liberal Christianity had finally come of age. Right on, as the liturgy of the day related. Women's liberation had even intruded itself into what was normally been made a male domain. In November 1972, a group of women from the Roman Catholic, Presbyterian, Methodist, Episcopal, United Church of Christ, and other denominations held a sister celebration. And at the Washington Square Methodist Church in New York City, choosing Reformation Day, the traditional commemoration of Martin Luther's nailing of his 95 theses on the church door. The women wrote their own unique service. It featured the liberation of apples. The service began with the reading of the Genesis account of the creation and fall, but rapidly assumed a relevant status. "We were told that we were agents of evil, corrupters of perfect creation," the leader chanted. "We fell for all that," the congregation replied in unison. "We were told that we were subordinate beings, derived from man, not uniquely created," the leader continued. "We fell for all of that," the faithful responded. The service featured apple juice, which was tagged the ferment of freedom. The woman added a new myth of Lilith, who was first created co-equal with Adam, but abandoned him because she refused to be subservient to him. God, a male chauvinist if ever there was one, then created Eve for Adam, a more compliant female who would minister to Adam's needs. Then Eve apparently climbed the apple tree, jumped over the garden wall, and left Adam standing there. This version does add dimension to the traditional Christian story of the creation. The flexibility of the conception of Jesus appears to be another feature of the contemporary Christianity. The Reverend Cecile Maxey of Parker, Colorado, for example, believes that Jesus wore short hair, not long hair, and has preached sermons against long hair. He was asked why the portraits of Jesus show him with long hair. "That's just an artist's conception, and you know how artists are," he replied. Maxey stated that the first paintings of Jesus were done hundreds of years after his death. and he is convinced that Jesus had short hair. Maxey, in charge of the First Baptist Church, is installing swimming pools, tennis courts, and a miniature golf course to provide an opportunity to witness. It is very unfortunate that Maxey has discarded the portraits of Jesus, for that raises a serious problem for the people in Jerusalem. The Rockefeller Museum there has a skeleton whose ankle bone has a steel nail driven through it. The relic was discovered in 1969, but its existence was kept secret until 1971. The relic is called the Yahuchanan bone because it was found in a coffin with that title inscribed on it. And when the discovery became known, scholars from around the world wrote to ask if the skeleton was that of Jesus. The Jerusalem scholars, on the basis of anthropologist Nico Haas's report of his findings on the structure of the skull, have determined that the skeleton is not that of Jesus. The skull, according to Haas, bore no resemblance to Christ as we know him from portraits. Perhaps the anthropologist should join Maxey's congregation. From Jesus freaks to portraits of Jesus, contemporary Christianity rocks with efforts to clarify its faith, define its beliefs, and make itself relevant to the modern world. Yet, the tensions existing in its divergent branches and the cankerous growth of splinter sects via television and radio evangelism make it virtually impossible to understand. The advent of electronic communications has made radio and television religious programs so popular and lucrative that a significant number of evangelists have done very well financially in building up their own private denominations. Younger evangelists are now pushing Graham and Roberts into the past, creating gaudier, more spectacular programs for bringing the faithful into the fold. A number of years ago, the evangelical world was shattered when Marjo Gortner, a well-known evangelist, became the subject of a documentary movie based on his experiences as a traveling evangelist. He had been brought up from early childhood as a religious prodigy, gaining great fame as a prototype of Christian youth. Then the fascination grew thin, and Marjo decided to blow the whistle on the circuit that had proven so lucrative to his fellow evangelists. The movie revealed the money-mad preacher casually and perhaps cynically shearing his sheep. The greatest fears of the fundamentalists were thus realized, and the old Elmer Gantry image seems doomed to follow them. The movie Marjo appeared perhaps at an auspicious time. Revivalists had been getting somewhat out of hand, as witness Reverend Ike, better known as the Reverend Frederick J. Eikerencoder II, in respectable Christian circles. Reverend Ike likes money. And for a time, he was simply another poor evangelist. But he soon developed a theology second to none in the modern world, discovering that most people were already in hell. Ike began telling his congregations to give him money, basing his message on the belief that the Bible says all things are possible. Combining a fascinating style with the propensity for greed found scattered among the unsaved, Ike is reported to spend $1,000 a week on clothes. And because this is rather expensive overhead to maintain, he asks his congregation for money to pay the bills. They caught it up. And as for Jesus, who is the standard product of other evangelists, one thing even Jesus didn't do, Ike preaches: he didn't save the world. As the various branches of American Christianity gather to continue to grow, Dr. Carl F. H. Henry, a noted Christian theologian, sees a rise of atheism on a world basis, without a recovery of those lively spiritual convictions and vitalities through which the church itself came into historical existence. Henry maintains Christianity is unlikely long to remain either a serious contender among world religions or an effective alternative to communist or any other ideology. The fall of the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall revealed that communism never was a viable ideology. What message does Western Christianity have for those who believed and practiced their religions, not because they were politically correct or economically advantageous, but because they offered hope and a sense of community? Therein lies the problem. Western Christians continue to view their religion as an alternative to personally disliked political, social, and economic theories. The alternative to the pot smoking environs of Woodstock is, for right wing Christianity, a crew cut, weightlifting, quarterbacking, and Christian folk singing rally in the Cotton Bowl with Jesus cheers, a religious Woodstock, as the promoters called it. Contemporary American Christianity can quite possibly be understood as having two major, apparently mutually exclusive emphases. The right wing, evangelical, and fundamentalist spectrum of Christianity dwells almost exclusively and fanatically on the figure of Jesus and on the familiar theology of the old time religion. However, its actual scholarly knowledge of Jesus and his times, the nature of the Roman world, and the movement of the early church is practically nil. The less it knows about the human being Jesus, the more comfortable it is because it is the idealized, law abiding, goody goody projections of themselves, which they call Jesus, that forms the object of their devotion. The predominance of whites in the right wing of Christianity, and their perpetual identification of Christianity as the opponent and mortal enemy of communism, socialism, free thinking, long hair, and other symbolic foes, makes their version of Christianity little more than a sacred patriotism, seeking to restore the imagined elegance of the last century to American society. Their position, with respect to social problems, is generally to ignore them. Graham, their leading spokesman, sees poverty and race problems as indications of the coming of the end of the world. He already finds 28 signs that the end is imminent, and he speculates that he would perhaps receive a favored place in the universe after Judgment Day as his reward. As ruler of a planet, perhaps. He notoriously avoids the Bible verses having to do with Christ being present in the prisons, among the hungry and poor, and living with the oppressed. The left wing is almost the opposite of its counterpart. It is probably best represented by the more traditional denominations, such as the Presbyterians, Methodists, United Church of Christ, Episcopalians, and Roman Catholics. Perhaps the Greek Orthodox Church should also be included in this category. For such denominations, the mention of Jesus is both an embarrassment and disappointment. Their primary theology can be summarized as a church theology. Every theological question presenting itself is solved by asking what the church should do about it. Inherent in their attitude is the presumption that they are by definition the world's religious and respectable people. They feel the only task remaining in the field of religion is to find a way to make their church relevant to the outside world. Most of them would take the second coming of Jesus as a personal affront, indicating that God had lost confidence in their ability to solve problems. The left wing thrives on social movements and fads of all kinds. Let someone advocate the use of hula hoops to illustrate a theological point, and they swarm to his corner. And these churches see their task as making American society respond to people, not as making American society change its basic presumptions. They have set aside large amounts of money for self-determination by minority groups as well as for studies to determine how to assist the wealthy of the world in filling their leisure time. Planning new liturgies and new ministries, they feel impelled to issue a pronouncement on each and every event occurring on the planet. And much of the social movement of the past 2 decades has been made possible by the work of these churches. And in that respect, they are probably more in tune with the state of American society than their fellow Christians on the right. Today, we find that the right wing of Christianity is growing quite fast, while the left wing, battered from indiscriminate support of demagogues in the power movements, is losing both members and financial support. Gary Willis, in Bare Ruined Choirs, has outlined the extent of eternal dimension within the Roman Catholic branch of Christendom, and one might only note that its basic problem is that of reconciling itself to the world of the 19th century. In spite of its most optimistic emotions, it has not yet begun to comprehend the 20th century or its most advanced 20th century man, Teilhard de Chardin. Intertwined in both branches of Christendom is the fast-rising Pentecostal movement, which finds its meaning in the underground church of the left and in some of the healing evangelicals on the right. Walter Hollenberger has compiled a 4,000-page handbook on Pentecostalism that discusses the phenomena to be encountered in this movement. Speaking in tongues, healing, and other activities can be found among Pentecostals of all persuasions. And, if anything, the movement testifies to the human need for experience and religion. While Christians are tearing themselves apart on the left or avoiding contact with the real world on the right, we are witnessing the rather frightening revival of demonism, devil worship, the astrological and numerological sciences, and other manifestations of the occult. Both the Pope and Billy Graham agree that this is the devil's work, but the persistence of such ancient forms of religious experience in the modern world can testify more to the desperate nature of the spiritual crisis rather than the active work of the devil. Even the devil can certainly think up something new in 2,000 years. Theologies come and go. Black theology apparently attempts to interpret the black experience in American society in religious terms. Carl McIntyre, a right-wing Christian, sponsors rallies in the nation's capital extolling the Christian virtues of killing one's enemy. Women's theologies, gay theologies, frontier theologies, and especially athletic theologies abound. At what point does America echo the plaintive cry of the Boston policeman, who was assigned to guard Cox's Easter celebration? This is not religion. It is chaos. It is chaos. The world in which Christianity arose no longer exists in its social and political sense. Even the world in which the most of today's theologians grew to adulthood no longer exists. The old certainties have become stumbling blocks, and the question is not whether one can make Christianity relevant in the modern world. The question is whether the modern world can have any valid religious experiences or knowledge whatsoever. The traditional assumptions that Christianity represented the highest form of evolved religion can no longer be considered valid, nor can the contention that it is the revealed truth of God, perhaps the only revealed truth. The majority of Christian leaders today do not derive their claim to the office of religious leader from their ability to project spiritual values. More often, they have been educated and trained to assume the reins of church leadership, or they have attracted large followings by simplifying the nature of religion into four spiritual principles or other formulas that are eagerly sought by people as a divine form of life insurance. The old charisma that attached to the truly religious man has been negated by the rapid pace of the modern world and is an extreme rarity today. Instead of observing other religions and finding that they are close to Christianity, Christians would be wise to begin a search for religious experience and certainty itself regardless of its consequences. If there is no means by which the modern world can come into religious integrity, we should accept our condition and shoulder our responsibility of humane treatment of one another as victims of an incomprehensible universe. But if we find our way religiously, we should have the courage to accept the revelation that comes and live in the manner it commands us. In 1972, when I was writing the first version of this book, I made a deliberate effort to keep track of the nonsensical things that were being promulgated about contemporary American Christianity. I do regret that I did not continue to keep a clippings file on the antics of American Christianity during the past 2 decades. The ridiculous and the sublime have manifested themselves in such amusing ways that an update of this chapter would have been a delightfully funny writing assignment. However, most people know of the developments in the recent past when several televangelists quarreled as their audiences and contributions began to wane, and we saw revelations of unsuspected proportions regarding their sexual and financial adventures. Oral Roberts, of course, topped the list of nonsense when he announced that God was trying to extort several $1 million from him. I was tempted at the time to announce that I also had spoken with God, that he was mightily displeased with Oral and distrusted his stewardship, and wanted everyone to send their contributions to me. Unfortunately, I had another agenda at the time, but it would have been fun. The rise of New Age spiritualism has most definitely intruded into the behavior patterns of contemporary Christianity. Hardly a day goes by that my work is not interrupted by a renegade Protestant minister who wants me to send him to an Indian medicine man for spiritual counseling, or by the news that some Christian church is now vesting its bishops and pastors into buckskins and feathers, or purchasing crystals for its rituals. Groups of American Indians have now made presentations at most of the Christian church national meetings and given their version of the reverence for nature. And a considerable number of Christian clergy have tried to do some version of the sweat lodge or vision quest. All of these things, taken together, make it seem as if we are now approaching a time when a new kind of religion will make itself manifest to us. If we view all this struggling for meaning in a world in which institutions and beliefs are rapidly eroding, then it seems likely that people are merely sporting out the correlation between beliefs and experiences. Thus, the religions that depend on the articulation of doctrinal propositions to maintain themselves are doomed to disappear beneath their own silliness. Those religious traditions that depend primarily upon invoking some kind of experience that is qualitatively distinct from everyday feelings will become the vehicles for religious expression in the future. All of this is to say that we will continue to see unqualified nonsense as the major product of the Christian churches. Jimmy and Tammy Faye Baker are only the first of the clowns to enter the arena. End of chapter 13.